She thought she was walking into a private donor meeting, just another hospital fundraiser, just another room full of powerful men pretending to care about people they would never have to sit beside in an emergency room. But the moment Dr. Grace Hartwell opened that door, every voice stopped, every glass froze, every man in the room looked at her like she had brought death in with her. She didn't know why the room went silent until she saw him. Lucian DeLuca, the most feared mafia boss in Philadelphia, watching her from the end of the table. But he wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the silver pendant around her neck, the one her dead husband left behind. And that pendant was connected to a murdered woman, a buried secret, and a truth powerful men had killed to protect. Welcome to our Mafia Boss Story channel, where some men are born to rule, and some lessons are never taught in school, only in the brutal classroom of life. This channel is not here to glorify crime. We tell stories about strategy, courage, loyalty, survival, and the hidden mindset behind real power. This story reminds us that silence can protect evil, but one brave person can break it. Sometimes strength is not about fighting with weapons. Sometimes it is about standing in a room full of danger and refusing to look away. If this story pulls you in, leave a like, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, share it with someone who loves powerful stories, and subscribe for more Mafia Boss tales about courage, wisdom, and power.
Grace Hartwell had never liked charity events. There was something about the soft music, the expensive flowers, and the polished smiles that always made suffering feel far away, as if pain became more acceptable once it was discussed under chandeliers. Rich people had a way of saying words like community, compassion, and underserved while holding champagne glasses that cost more than the medication some of her patients could not afford. But Grace was there anyway. Her emergency department needed money. That was the truth of it. The ventilators were old. The nurses were exhausted. The supply cabinets had begun to look thinner every month, and every new hospital memo seemed to use kinder language for the same ugly message. Do more with less. Grace knew what less looked like. It looked like a mother waiting 8 hours with a feverish child. It looked like an old man choosing between blood pressure pills and groceries. It looked like a nurse crying in a storage closet because there were no beds left, and 3 ambulances were still on the way. So she had put on a black dress, clipped her hospital badge inside her purse, and driven to the fundraiser with one goal: find the donor, make the case, and leave before anyone asked her to smile for a photograph. Around her neck hung the silver pendant Thomas had left behind. She almost had not worn it. For 6 months, it had stayed in the top drawer of her nightstand. Inside the small envelope her husband had hidden behind a stack of tax documents. Grace had found it 2 days after his funeral, when the house still smelled like flowers and sympathy cards. There had been no explanation, only the pendant, old and slightly tarnished, and a note in Thomas's handwriting. If anything happens to me, wear this where people can see it. At the time, Grace thought grief had made the message feel stranger than it was. Thomas had been frightened in the final weeks of his life. He had stopped sleeping. He had taken phone calls in the garage. He had kissed her like he wanted to apologize, but could not find the right beginning. Then his car went off a wet road outside the city, and the police called it drunk driving. Grace had never believed that. Thomas had secrets. She was no longer foolish enough to deny that. But he had not been drunk that night. He had not even liked driving in the rain. Now the pendant rested against her skin, cold and light, while the ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel shimmered around her. Dr. Hartwell. Grace turned to find a young event coordinator holding a tablet against her chest. She could not have been older than 25, with a headset in one ear and panic hidden under professional lipstick. Yes, Mr. Mercer is running a few minutes behind, but one of his associates asked if you could meet in the private room near the East Corridor. I can have someone show you. Grace glanced toward the stage, where a string quartet played softly beneath a banner, thanking donors for building a healthier Philadelphia. Which room? The coordinator pointed across the ballroom, end of the hall, Heavy wooden door. You can't miss it. Grace thanked her and began walking. She passed clusters of board members, donors, physicians, and politicians. A few people recognized her and nodded. One older surgeon lifted his glass in greeting, but Grace only gave him a small smile and kept moving. She did not belong in rooms like this. Not really, she belonged under fluorescent lights, in running shoes, with a trauma pager clipped to her waistband and blood pressure numbers, moving through her mind faster than conversation. The east corridor was quieter. The music faded behind her. The carpet swallowed the sound of her heels. At the end of the hall, exactly as promised, stood a heavy wooden door. Grace knocked once. No one answered. She opened it, and the room went silent. Not the ordinary silence of strangers noticing an interruption. Not the polite pause of people waiting to see if someone had made a mistake. This silence had weight. It fell all at once, hard and complete, as if every voice in the room had been cut by the same invisible blade. Grace stood in the doorway with one hand still on the brass handle. The inside was not a donor meeting. It was a private dining room, dimly lit, with a long table at the center and nearly a dozen men seated around it. Dark suits, heavy watches, faces that did not soften when they looked at her. The table held untouched plates, half-empty glasses, and a folder lying open beside a crystal ashtray. One man slowly lowered his drink. Another looked at Grace, then looked away so quickly it felt deliberate. A third man stared at the pendant on her neck and went pale. Grace's first thought was simple and absurd. Wrong room. Her second thought came a heartbeat later. Not safe. I am sorry, she said, keeping her voice steady. I was told this was where I was supposed to meet someone. No one answered. Then Grace saw the man at the far end of the table. He had not moved when she entered. He sat with one hand resting beside a glass of red wine he had not touched. His hair was dark with silver at the temples. His face was calm, in a way that did not feel peaceful. It felt controlled, dangerous, like a locked door with something alive behind it. Lucian DeLuca. Grace knew the name. Everyone in Philadelphia knew the name, even if they pretended not to. It appeared in whispers, in sealed indictments that never seemed to become trials, in restaurants that never had empty tables, in docks where certain shipments moved faster than others. No one said mafia boss in public. They said businessman. They said local influence. They said complicated family, but looking at him now, Grace understood why the softer words existed. People needed language that made fear easier to swallow. Lucian DeLuca was watching her. At first, Grace thought he was looking at her face. Then his gaze lowered, just slightly, and fixed on the silver pendant at her throat. Something changed in the room, not loudly. Nothing obvious is enough to name. But every man there seemed to hold his breath. Lucian stood. The movement was unhurried. Yet it made the room feel smaller. No one else moved. No one spoke. He walked toward her with the measured calm of a man who had never needed to rush toward anything in his life. Grace forced herself not to step back. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to see the faint scar near his left eyebrow, far enough that he could not be accused of touching her space. His eyes remained on the pendant. Where did you get that? His voice was low, not loud, not theatrical, somehow worse. Grace's fingers brushed the chain before she could stop herself. My husband left it to me. The silence deepened. One of the men at the table muttered something under his breath. Another made the sign of the cross. Lucian's eyes lifted to hers. Your husband's name. Grace swallowed. Thomas Hartwell. For the first time, Lucian's expression shifted. It was small, almost nothing. But Grace saw it because she was trained to see almost nothing. A flicker at the jaw, a tightening around the eyes. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. Thomas Hartwell is dead, he said. Grace went cold. Yes, how? The question landed too sharply. Grace should have told him it was none of his business. She should have turned around, walked back to the ballroom, and found security. Though something in her already understood security would not help here. Instead, she answered, car accident, 6 months ago. Lucian looked back at the pendant, then he said, no, he died carrying a dead woman as secret. The words moved through Grace like a chill under the skin. Before she could respond, a large man with broad shoulders and tired eyes rose from the table. Lucian did not look at him, but the man came anyway, as if summoned by breath alone. Rocco, Lucian said, see Dr. Hartwell out. Grace stiffened. I can see myself out. Lucian's gaze returned to her face. I know, that was all he said. Rocco approached, careful and silent. He did not grab her arm. He only opened the door wider and waited. Grace looked once more at Lucian DeLuca. He was still watching her. But not the way men usually watched women, in rooms where they thought they held power. There was no hunger in it, no amusement, no casual threat. There was grief, and that frightened her more. She stepped back into the corridor. The door closed behind her, cutting off the room, the men, and Lucien DeLuca's stare. Rocco walked beside her without speaking. When they reached the service exit near the back of the hotel, Grace stopped. Who was she? Rocco looked at her. The dead woman, Grace said. The one he meant. For a moment, she thought he would not answer. Then he said, Sophia DeLuca. The name meant nothing to Grace, but Rocco's face told her it should. She was his sister, he added. And that necklace was buried with no one because we never found it after she died. Grace's hand went to the pendant again. This time, it felt heavier. Outside, the night air hit her like water. She walked quickly to the parking garage, her pulse steady, only because years in emergency medicine had taught her that panic was useless until the bleeding stopped. She got into her car, locked the doors, and sat in the dark. Her phone buzzed, unknown number. Grace stared at the screen. Thomas died because he tried to return what he stole. Don't trust DeLuca. Don't trust the hospital, and whatever you do, don't take off the necklace. Grace stopped breathing for 1 second. Then slowly, she looked into the rearview mirror. A black car sat half a block behind her, engine running. Headlights off, she could not see who was inside. But she knew one thing with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. The room had gone silent because of the necklace. Lucien DeLuca had watched her because of the dead woman who once wore it, and Thomas, her quiet husband with his careful smile and unfinished apologies, had left her something far more dangerous than grief. He had left her a key, and somewhere in Philadelphia, someone had just realized she was wearing it in plain sight. Grace Hartwell did not sleep that night. She tried. She went through the motions because going through motions was something she understood. She locked the front door twice. She placed her purse on the kitchen counter. She removed her heels and set them neatly beside the closet. She washed her face, brushed her teeth, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror long enough to see that she looked calmer than she felt. That was one of the useful lies the body could tell. A steady face did not always mean a steady heart. The silver pendant rested against her collarbone. She had almost taken it off 3 times. Each time, her fingers touched the chain, and each time, the text message came back to her, like a voice in the dark. Whatever you do, don't take off the necklace. Grace did not like being told what to do by strangers. She liked it even less when the warning sounded reasonable, so she left it on. Not because she trusted the person who sent the message, and not because she trusted Lucien DeLuca. She left it on because Thomas had asked her to wear it where people could see it, and for 6 months she had been trying to understand the last strange thing her husband ever gave her. By 5 in the morning, she had made coffee strong enough to taste bitter before it touched her tongue. By 6, she had searched Sophia DeLuca's name online and found almost nothing useful. An old obituary, a nursing license record, a short article about a fatal car fire 12 years earlier outside Camden. No crime report, no trial, no suspect. Just a dead young woman reduced to 3 polite paragraphs, and a photograph too blurry to study. At 7, Grace called the hospital and said she was taking a personal day. Her supervisor sounded surprised. Grace never took personal days. That was probably why he approved it without arguing. At 8, she called Claire Whitaker. Claire answered on the 4th ring, her voice rough with sleep. Someone better be dying. Not today, Grace said. That sounds like something you say right before someone starts dying. I need the name of a lawyer who handles criminal issues quietly. There was a pause, not long. Just long enough for Claire to wake fully. Grace, I'm not in trouble. People who are not in trouble don't ask for quiet criminal lawyers before breakfast. Grace closed her eyes. She could see the private room again, the silence, the men, Lucien DeLuca standing slowly, his eyes fixed on her necklace as though it had cut him open. I walked into something last night, Grace said. I don't know what it is yet, Claire said nothing for a moment when she spoke again. The sleep was gone from her voice. Where are you? Home. Stay there. No, Grace. I am going to find Lucien de Luca. The silence on Claire's end was different from the silence in the room the night before, but not by much. Tell me you did not just say what I think you said. I need to know why he recognized Thomas's necklace, then call the police. Grace almost laughed, but there was no humor in her. Thomas died in a one-car accident they closed in 48 hours. If the police wanted to know the truth, they had 6 months. That does not mean the mafia is your next best option. I didn't say best, I said next. Claire cursed softly. Send me your location every 15 minutes. And Grace, yes. If you get murdered, I am going to be furious. Grace smiled despite herself. It was small and tired, but it was real. Noted. She found the restaurant by following a rumor Thomas had once mentioned after too much wine, and not enough caution. An old Italian place in South Philadelphia with green awnings, dark windows, and no sign that said closed. Though the chairs were still turned upside down on the tables when Grace arrived. The neighborhood was awake around it. Delivery trucks coughed at the curb. A man hosed down the sidewalk in front of a bakery. Somewhere nearby, bread was baking, and the smell moved strangely through the cold morning air. Too warm for the kind of conversation Grace had come to have. A black sedan sat across the street. Grace looked at it for 3 seconds, then crossed toward the restaurant. Before she reached the door, it opened. Rocco Bellini filled the frame. He looked exactly as he had the night before, broad, tired-eyed, and carved from something harder than patience. We reclosed, he said. Grace stopped one step below him. I am not here for breakfast. No. Tell him the woman with the necklace wants to know why Men's stopped breathing when she walked into the room. Rocco's expression did not change, but his eyes moved to the pendant, just for a second. That was enough. Grace had spent years watching people give themselves away in flashes. The patient who said the pain was mild, but held his breath when he moved. The addict who denied using but covered the inside of his elbow. The grieving husband who cried too loudly and never once asked what time his wife had died. Rocco knew the pendant. They all did. He stepped aside. Grace walked in. The restaurant smelled of coffee, old wood, and tomato sauce that had seeped into the walls over decades. The lights were low, the tables were empty. At the back of the dining room, beneath a framed photograph of men Grace did not recognize, Lucien de Luca sat alone with 2 cups of coffee on the table. He had been expecting her. That annoyed her more than it should have. Dr. Hartwell, he said. Mr. De Luca, Lucien, no. A faint change touched his mouth, not quite a smile. Fair. Grace remained standing. You knew I would come. I knew you would want answers. That's not the same thing. No, he said. It is tea. He gestured to the chair across from him. Grace did not sit right away. She looked at the exits first. Front door, kitchen door, hallway to the restrooms. She looked for cameras and saw one in the corner, angled toward the entrance. Lucien watched her do it. Good, he said. Grace's eyes cut back to him. Good. You check exits before sitting down. That means you afraid, but not stupid. I'm not afraid. Then you are stupid. The words should have angered her. They did, a little. But there was no insult in his tone, only assessment. It was the way surgeons spoke when a scan showed something ugly and denial would waste time. Grace sat. Lucien reached inside his jacket slowly enough that she understood. The movement was deliberate. He removed a photograph and laid it on the table between them. Grace did not touch it. The woman in the photograph was young. Maybe 26 or 27. Dark hair, serious eyes, a soft face with a stubborn mouth. She stood outside what looked like a clinic, wearing scrubs under a winter coat. Around her neck was the same silver pendant Grace wore now. The room seemed to narrow. That was Sophia, Lucien said. My sister. Grace stared at the photograph until the woman's face blurred slightly, then sharpened again. Rocco said she died, murdered. The article said car fire. The article was wrong. Grace looked up, or rewritten, this time. Lucien did smile, but there was no warmth in it. Thomas chose well. The sound of her husband's name in his mouth made her spine stiffen. Do not talk about him like you knew him. I knew of him. That's not the same thing. No, Lucien said again. It is. He leaned back, studying her with the same controlled focus he had shown in the private room. Grace hated the feeling of being examined. She was usually the one doing the examining. She was the one who looked at people under bright lights and asked where it hurt. She did not like sitting across from a man who seemed to understand pain without asking for permission. Sophia was a nurse, he said. She volunteered at clinics that served people no one else wanted to treat: homeless men, undocumented workers, elderly patients with no insurance, people who learned to apologize before asking for help. Grace's hands tightened in her lap. She found something. Lucian continued. Medication that did not work, blood thinners that failed, heart drugs that tested wrong, anti-seizure medication cut with fillers. At first, she thought it was a supplier issue. Then she realized the pattern only appeared in clinics and hospital wings serving poor patients. Grace thought of the emergency department, the crowded waiting room, the patients who arrived too late because they were afraid of the bill, the way poverty made every diagnosis more complicated and every death easier for administrators to explain away. "What does that have to do with Thomas?" she asked. Sophia said she had given evidence to a hospital accountant, someone who could follow invoices, contracts, payments, someone inside the system. Thomas. Lucian nodded. Grace looked back at the photo. Why would he have her necklace? That is what I want to know. You said he stole it. I said your husband died, carrying a dead woman's secret. The men in that room assumed theft. I do not assume anything when grief is involved. Grief makes men careless. It also makes them wrong. This it was the first thing Lucian said that made Grace want to believe him. She hated that. What do you want from me? She asked. Whatever Thomas left behind, and if he left nothing. Lucian's eyes remained steady. Then someone killed him because they believed he did. Grace felt the words settle in her chest with an awful, practical weight. He died in an accident. No, Lucian said. He died in a story someone wanted you to accept. Grace pushed back from the table and stood. You don't know that. I know clean endings are usually manufactured. You expect me to trust you. No, the answer stopped her. Lucian looked up at her, calm as ever. I expect you to distrust me intelligently. Grace said nothing. There is likely a safe deposit box, he continued. Men like Thomas do not keep dangerous evidence at home. They keep it somewhere that requires paperwork, identification, and time. You will open it. You will make copies. You will keep the originals with someone you trust. Then you will decide what I see. Grace narrowed her eyes. You are giving me instructions. I am giving you survival habits, and if I refuse. Lucian stood then, slowly. Then I will still have someone watching your building tonight. That sounds like a threat. No. Dr. Hartwell, a threat is what I give guilty men. His voice lowered, not in volume but in weight. This is protection. It is simply the kind, decent people hate admitting they need. Grace searched his face for the lie. She was good at that. Better than most. She had seen addicts, abusers, frightened parents, guilty spouses, and administrators who could bury negligence under polished concern. Lies had rhythm. They came too quickly or too slowly. They dressed themselves in extra details. They asked for sympathy before offering truth. Lucian DeLuca did none of that. He was dangerous. But he was not lying. Grace picked up the photograph of Sophia and looked at the pendant around the young woman's neck. Then she placed it back on the table. I opened the box with my attorney present, she said. I keep the originals. You get copies only if I decide you should. Your men do not enter my apartment, my hospital, or my life without my permission. Rocco, standing near the kitchen, made a sound that might have been a laugh. Lucian did not look away from Grace. Good, he said. Good. A woman who makes rules under pressure is more likely to survive than one who begs for mercy. Grace should have felt insulted. Instead, she felt seen in a way that made her uncomfortable. She turned to leave. At the door, Lucian said, Dr. Hartwell. Grace stopped but did not turn around. Your husband was afraid at the end. Her throat tightened. I know, but he was not only afraid. Now she turned. Lucian's face was unreadable. He gave you the necklace because he believed someone would recognize it. He sent you into a room full of wolves, wearing the one thing that would make them stop biting long enough to look. Grace's hand rose to the pendant. That does not make him innocent, Lucian said. But it may mean he was trying to be brave. Grace left before he could see what those words did to her. Outside, the black sedan was still parked across the street. For the first time, she understood it might have been there not to trap her. but to follow anyone who tried. That did not make her feel safe, but it made the danger clearer. And Grace had always preferred a clear danger to a comforting lie. Grace Hartwell had opened hundreds of doors in her life, knowing something terrible might be waiting on the other side. Exam rooms, trauma bays, family consultation rooms where the air already knew bad news before anyone said it out loud. But the small steel door of the safe deposit room felt different. It did not smell like antiseptic or blood or burnt coffee. It smelled like metal, carpet cleaner, and old money. It smelled like secrets that had waited patiently because they knew the living would eventually run out of places to hide. Claire Whitaker stood beside her, arms folded tightly across her chest. She had insisted on driving. She had also insisted on carrying a legal pad, 2 pens, a portable scanner, and a can of pepper spray she kept in her purse for emotional support. Grace had not argued. Claire was a malpractice attorney, which meant she was used to smiling at powerful men while preparing to cut them open with paperwork. If Grace was going to walk into whatever Thomas had left behind, she wanted Claire there. The bank manager was a narrow man with silver glasses and the nervous courtesy of someone who had been trained never to ask why grieving widows arrived with lawyers. He checked Grace's identification twice, compared her signature to a document Thomas had filed 3 years earlier, and unlocked the private room with a small brass key. He placed the metal box on the table and stepped away, saying they could take all the time they needed. After he left, neither woman moved. Claire looked at Grace. "You didn't have to do this all at once." Grace almost smiled. That's what people say before something gets worse. That is because people are usually right. Grace touched the pendant at her throat. It had not left her neck since the night before. She could still feel the private room around her when she closed her eyes. The men falling silent. Lucian DeLuca's stare, Rocco's voice telling her Sophia had been his sister, and Lucian saying Thomas had died carrying a dead woman's secret. She opened the box. There was no cash inside, no jewelry, no passport, no dramatic stack of fake identities. The kind found in movies where every secret came with a convenient explanation. Thomas had always been tidier than that. Even his fear had apparently been organized. Inside the box were 4 things: a black USB drive taped to the back of a business card, a folder of shipping invoices, a photograph, and a sealed envelope with Grace's name written in Thomas' careful handwriting. For a few seconds, she could not touch any of it. Claire said softly, "Grace, I know." But she did not know. That was the problem. For 6 months she had lived with grief. Grief was awful, but it had rules. A person died. People brought food. Bills arrived. The closet stayed full of shirts that no longer had a body to fit. You learned which side of the bed to avoid touching. You learned that mornings were worse than nights because waking up required remembering all over again. This was not grief. This was revision. Grace picked up the photograph first. Thomas stood outside a clinic with a woman Grace recognized from Lucian's picture, Sophia DeLuca. They were younger in the photo, both of them. Thomas wore a gray coat and a serious expression. Sophia stood beside him in scrubs under a winter jacket, the silver pendant bright against her throat. They were not smiling, but they looked like people who had survived the same storm, long enough to agree on the direction of escape. Claire leaned closer. That's her. Grace nodded. Sophia, the dead sister. Grace hated how simple that sounded. Dead sister, dead husband. Dead patients. Maybe. Words could make anything sound manageable if they were short enough. She set the photo down and opened the folder. The pages inside were invoices, shipping manifests, purchase orders, and delivery confirmations. Most of it meant nothing to her at first. Company names, lot numbers, distribution codes, hospital supply references. Claire began photographing each page with her phone, her face tightening with every document. "This is not small," Claire said. "No, no. These are pharmaceutical shipments. Some are through shell vendors. Some look like charitable supply transfers. Some are marked as donated inventory." She flipped another page. Thomas was tracking movement between suppliers, clinics, and hospital wings. Grace picked up one invoice and froze. She knew that drug name, then another, and another. Her medical brain came awake before her heart could catch up. Warfarin, levetiracetam, metoprolol, insulin. blood thinners, anti-seizure medication, heart medication, diabetic supplies, not glamorous drugs. Not the kind that made headlines because people stole them to get high. These were ordinary life-saving medications. The kind poor patients needed every day. The kind doctors trusted because the alternative was unthinkable. Grace turned the page slowly. These batch numbers. Claire looked at her. What about them? I've seen some of them, at the hospital. Grace did not answer right away. She was back in the emergency department, standing over an elderly man whose blood would not thin the way it should have. A young woman seizing even after the right dose. A diabetic patient whose numbers made no sense, all those cases filed away in her mind as complications. Delayed care, poverty, bad luck, bad luck. Grace felt suddenly cold. Claire noticed. What is it? Grace looked at the invoices again. If these records mean what I think they mean, someone may have been replacing real medication with counterfeits. Claire stared at her. Inside hospitals, or clinics, or supply chains that feed both. Grace's voice sounded too calm, even to herself. The deaths would not always look suspicious. Poor patients come in late. Elderly patients have complications. People without insurance have messy medical histories. If a drug fails, it is easy to blame the body instead of the bottle. Claire lowered her phone. Jesus. Grace picked up the USB drive. It was small and black, with no label. Thomas had taped it behind an old business card from Hartwell Medical Finance, the company he had worked for before joining the hospital system. She turned it over in her palm. It felt absurdly light for something that might have gotten him killed. Then she opened the envelope. The first line nearly stopped her. Grace, if you are reading this, I failed to keep you out of it. She sat down. Claire stepped closer but said nothing. Grace continued reading. I am sorry, I know those words will not be enough. I loved you. That is true. But I came into your life through a lie. And I do not know how to make that sentence less ugly. If I am gone, it means Mercer knows I tried to return what I helped bury. Sophia was right. Lucien de Luca was not the man we were told to fear. Or maybe he was, but not for the reasons we were given. Grace stopped there, the letters blurred. She did not cry. Crying would have felt too simple, instead. She felt as though someone had reached into her chest and moved every memory a few inches out of place. Claire put a hand on the table. Mercer. Grace nodded once. Elliot Mercer, chairman of the hospital board. Donor, philanthropist, the man whose name appeared on building plaques, gala invitations, and press releases about community care. The man Grace was supposed to meet the night she walked into Lucien de Luca's room. We need to make copies, Claire said. Grace folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. We make copies of everything. You keep the originals. Claire's eyebrows lifted. And De Luca. He gets what I decide he gets. For the first time that morning, Claire looked almost proud. Good. They spent 40 minutes scanning, photographing, and cataloging everything. Claire worked with the tense precision of someone preparing for war in court. Grace worked like she was handling contaminated instruments. Careful, methodical, no wasted motion. If she stopped long enough to feel everything, she was afraid she would not start again. By the time they left the bank, the sky had turned the flat gray of late morning. Claire took the originals to her office. Grace kept a duplicate folder and a copy of the USB drive inside her coat. Lucien was waiting at the restaurant when she arrived. Of course he was. Rocco stood near the door, but he did not block her this time. Grace walked past him into the same quiet dining room where Lucien had shown her Sophia's photograph. The table was empty except for coffee and a single manila envelope placed in front of Lucien. Grace stayed standing and set her folder on the table. These are copies, she said. Lucien did not touch them. You kept the originals, yes? He nodded. Good. Grace had expected anger, suspicion, a demand, something that would let her place him neatly back into the category where dangerous men belonged. Instead, he said, never give a dangerous man the only copy of the truth. Not even me. She hated how much she respected that answer. Lucien opened the folder and examined the first few pages. His expression did not change, but the room seemed to grow colder. Rocco moved closer behind him, reading over his shoulder. Grace watched both men carefully. No surprise at the drug names. No confusion about the shipping codes. Recognition, maybe. Anger, certainly. But not ignorance. You know these suppliers, Grace said. Lucian looked up. That was not a question, he said. No. A brief silence passed between them. Then Lucian said, some of them move through docks I control, some through docks I do not. Until now. I believed they were moving stolen inventory, not fake medication. No. Grace studied him. You expect me to believe that. I expect you to test it against what you see. That was the maddening thing about him. He did not beg to be believed. He simply placed his version of the truth down like a blade and waited to see if she cut herself on it. Grace pulled one page from the folder and pointed to 3 lot numbers. These drugs went to clinics and hospital units serving low-income patients. Not private surgical centers, not wealthy neighborhoods. Places where people die and no one asks too many questions. Lucian's eyes darkened. What do you see? He asked. Grace looked down at the page. She thought of Thomas's letter, Sophia's photograph. The old man in Trauma Bay 3, whose blood work never made sense. The young mother apologizing because she could not afford her insulin. Then she said, I see murder designed to look like bad luck. Rocco went still. Lucian did not move at all, but something in his face changed. Something old and wounded. What? Grace asked. Lucian looked at the pendant around her neck, then back at the invoice. Sophia said almost the same thing before she died. Grace felt the necklace against her skin. For the first time, it did not feel like Thomas's final mystery. It felt like a door opening. And behind that door, the dead were not resting. They were waiting. By noon the next day, Grace Hartwell had returned to the emergency department because fear did not cancel shifts and grief did not stop patients from bleeding. That was one of the cruelest things about real life. Even when a person's world cracked open, the rest of the world kept asking for signatures, prescriptions, discharge papers, and lunch breaks that never came. Grace moved through the hospital with the duplicate files locked in her office drawer and the silver pendant hidden beneath the collar of her white coat. She had considered leaving it at home, but the thought lasted only a second. Thomas had told her to wear it where people could see it. The stranger in the text had told her not to take it off. Lucien De Luca had looked at it like it had brought his dead sister back into the room. For the first time, Grace understood that the pendant was not only a memory, it was a signal, and whether she liked it or not, she had already sent it. The emergency department was crowded before lunch. A construction worker with a crushed hand. A child with a fever that would not break. A woman in her 70s complaining of chest pressure while apologizing for being a bother. Grace treated them one by one, her face calm, her hands steady, her mind divided. Part of her listened to heart sounds and lab results. Another part kept seeing batch numbers printed on invoices Thomas had hidden in a bank vault. Blood thinners, anti-seizure drugs, heart medication. The same ordinary names she trusted every day, now carrying the possibility of murder. At 1:14 p.m., the hospital changed its face. Cameras arrived first, then 2 communication staff members walking too quickly in heels. Then the chief medical officer, smiling like a man who had practiced in an elevator. Finally, surrounded by board members and donors, Elliot Mercer entered the emergency department wearing a white suit so clean. It looked almost theatrical beneath the fluorescent lights. Grace had seen Mercer before, of course. Everyone had. His picture hung in the hospital's north wings beside a bronze plaque thanking him for his generosity. He appeared in newspaper articles about healthcare access and charity partnerships. He gave interviews with his hands folded, his voice gentle, his silver hair combed neatly back. The city called him the Saint of Philadelphia. And the nickname had followed him so long that most people had stopped questioning who had given it to him first. He moved through the emergency department as if the suffering around him had been arranged for the cameras. He paused beside a nurse and thanked her for her service. He bent slightly to speak with a child holding an ice pack against his head. He told a reporter that every patient deserved dignity, no matter their income. Around him, administrators nodded with the relieved enthusiasm of people standing near money. Grace watched from beside the medication station, one chart in her hand and a warning moving slowly through her body. Mercer was good. That was the first thing she admitted to herself. Not charming in a careless way, not obvious. He did not overplay kindness. He gave just enough warmth to make people lean toward him, and just enough humility to make them forgive the cost of his suit. If Grace had not read Thomas' letter, if she had not seen the invoices, if she had not watched Lucien de Luca go silent at the mention of Sophia's words, she might have believed the performance. Then Mercer saw her. His eyes found her across the room, and for half a second, the performance stopped. It was so brief that no camera would have caught it. His smile remained. His shoulders did not tighten, his pace did not change, but Grace saw his gaze drop to the small shape beneath her collar, where the pendant pressed faintly against the fabric of her coat. Then his eyes returned to her face. "Dr. Hartwell," he said, approaching with both hands extended as though they were old friends. "I was hoping I would see you today." Grace accepted his handshake. His palm was warm, dry, controlled. "Mr. Mercer, I was disappointed we missed each other at the fundraiser." His smile softened at the edges. "I heard there was some confusion about the meeting room. A normal person might have said it lightly and moved on. Mercer said it like he already knew exactly which door she had opened." Grace gave him nothing. It was a busy evening. "Yes," he said. "Those events can become crowded with the wrong people." Behind him, a reporter lifted a camera. Mercer angled his body slightly, keeping Grace inside the frame. "I wanted to personally thank you," he continued, his voice rich enough for the microphone nearby. "Doctors like you are the reason this hospital still means something to families who have nowhere else to go." The words were perfect. Grace hated them. "Families need working systems more than speeches," she said. One of the administrators beside Mercer blinked. Mercer only smiled wider. "Spoken like someone who has spent too much time doing the hard work and not enough time being thanked for it." His eyes dropped again, just once. "Beautiful necklace," he said. "A family piece." Grace felt the chain against her skin. "Something my husband left me." Mercer's thumb moved across the side of his ring. That was all. A tiny motion, almost nothing, but bodies did not waste movement, not under pressure. Not when the mind was fighting to stay composed. "Thomas was a good man," Mercer said. Grace held his gaze. "You knew him well. Well enough to be saddened by his death." "That is not what I asked." For the first time, the people around them seemed to feel the air change. The chief medical officer gave a nervous little laugh, as if trying to soften the edge of the conversation. Mercer did not look away from Grace. "No," he said gently. "I suppose it was tea." Before he could say more, an alarm sounded from Trauma Bay 3. A nurse called Grace's name, and Grace turned instantly. Grateful for the crisis, because crisis had rules. She stepped away from Mercer and moved toward the bay, where Samuel O'Rourke, 72 years old, retired security guard, widower, and regular visitor to the emergency department, lay pale and sweating beneath the harsh lights. Samuel had come in with shortness of breath and chest pain. His history was complicated but familiar. Heart disease, prior clotting issues, medication he took when he could afford it and stretched when he could not. Grace had treated him twice before. He always apologized for taking up space. That alone made her want to fight harder for him. His labs came back wrong. Not wildly wrong. That would have been easier. They came back just wrong enough to make her frown. The blood thinner he had received should have changed the numbers by now. It had not. Grace checked the dose. Correct. Time given. Correct. Medication pulled from hospital supply. Correct. She ordered a repeat test, then another. Samuel's breathing worsened. His blood pressure dropped. The room filled with motion. Grace worked with the clean intensity that always came over her when life narrowed to seconds. Orders left her mouth before panic could enter the room. Oxygen, repeat imaging, call cardiology, prepare for transfer. She watched the monitors, watched Samuel's face, watched the medication record in the corner of her vision, like it had become a suspect. They did everything right. Samuel O'Rourke died anyway. Afterward, the room emptied slowly. Nurses moved with the heavy silence that follows a death no one is ready to accept. Grace stayed beside the bed longer than she needed to, one gloved hand resting on the rail. Samuel's face had gone peaceful in the unfair way the dead sometimes looked, as if the body wanted to hide how hard it had fought. The chief medical officer found her 15 minutes later in the medication room. "Grace," he said carefully, "I know that was difficult." She turned with the medication vial in her hand. "I want this lot tested independently." His expression changed. There's no indication of a medication issue. The anticoagulation response was wrong. He was elderly. His history was complex. So we blame his age. I am saying we need to be careful before we imply a supply problem. Grace looked at him then. Really looked. The careful voice, the administrative sadness, the fear tucked beneath the concern. Careful for whom? She asked. He did not answer. By the end of her shift, Grace had taken photographs of the vial, recorded the lot number, and sent the information to Claire through an encrypted message. Then she did something that would have seemed unthinkable 48 hours earlier. She called Lucien DeLuca. He answered on the second ring. Dr. Hartwell, Elliot Mercer came to the hospital today. Silence. He saw the pendant, she said. He recognized it. Lucian's voice changed only slightly. Are you certain? Yes. What else? A patient died after receiving a blood thinner that should have worked. Same kind of pattern we discussed. Same kind of drug. I asked for independent testing, and my supervisor tried to stop me. There was no immediate reply. Grace heard only the faint sound of traffic on his end. Then Lucian said, "Where are you?" "At the hospital." "Stay there." "No, Grace." It was the first time he had used her first name, she noticed. She wished she had not. "I am not one of your men," she said. "No," Lucian answered. "If you were, you would listen better." Despite herself, she almost smiled. Almost. "I need to know more about Sophia," she said. "Not the case, her." That request brought a longer silence. Then Lucian said, "I will send a car. I can drive, I know. I am sending a car anyway." She should have refused. Instead, she stood in the dim back hallway of the hospital, staring at the pendant beneath her coat, and realized that whatever had begun in that silent room was no longer waiting for her permission. 40 minutes later, Grace stood inside a narrow row house in South Philadelphia that smelled of lemon polish, old wood, and Sunday sauce. Teresa DeLuca opened the door herself. She was smaller than Grace expected, with white hair pinned neatly at the back of her head and eyes that looked as if they had survived more than one lifetime. Lucian stood behind Grace but said nothing. Teresa's gaze lowered to the pendant. Her hand went to the edge of the hallway table. For one terrible second, Grace thought the older woman might fall. "Sophia wore that," Teresa whispered, "the night she promised me she would come home." Grace reached for the clasp at the back of her neck. "Then maybe it should be yours." She removed the pendant and placed it gently on the table between them. Teresa looked at it for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "No, dear." Grace's throat tightened. "It belonged to your daughter." "Yes," Teresa said. Her voice did not break, and somehow that made it sadder. "And if it found its way to you after all these years, then it still has work to do." Grace looked from Teresa to Lucien. For the first time since Thomas died, she understood that grief was not always something people carried because they could not let go. Sometimes grief stayed because the truth had not finished speaking. Grace Hartwell drove home with Sophia DeLuca's pendant resting against her chest like a second heartbeat. Teresa had refused to take it back, and somehow that made the necklace feel heavier than it had before. It was no longer Thomas's strange final gift. It was no longer only Sophia's missing keepsake. It had become a responsibility. And Grace was beginning to understand that responsibility did not always arrive with permission. Sometimes it was placed in your hand by the dead, and all you could do was decide whether to carry it or drop it. The city was dark by the time she reached her apartment building. Rain had started, thin and cold, streaking the windshield in silver lines. Grace sat in the car for a moment after parking, watching the windows of her building. Third floor, corner unit. One lamp on in her living room, because she always left one lamp on now. After Thomas died, darkness had become too large. It made the rooms feel like they were waiting for someone who would never come home. She noticed the front door of the building did not latch behind the woman leaving with a grocery bag. That was not unusual. The lock had been loose for months. Grace had complained twice. Management had promised to send someone. Promises, she had learned, were often just polite delays wearing clean shirts. Upstairs, the hallway smelled faintly of damp coats and old carpet. Grace reached her door and stopped. The deadbolt was unlocked. She was certain she had locked it. Grace was the kind of person who checked locks the way other people checked mirrors. Once before leaving, once after leaving, in memory, she stood still, keys in hand, and listened. Nothing, no footsteps, no voices, no movement inside. Her first instinct was to go in. Her second, better instinct stopped her. She stepped back, pulled out her phone, and almost dialed 911. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she thought of Thomas' accident report. Clean and fast and convenient. She thought of the hospital administrator telling her not to test Samuel O'Rourke's medication. She thought of Elliot Mercer smiling beneath fluorescent lights while his thumb rubbed the side of his ring. Grace did not call the police. She called Lucien DeLuca. He answered on the second ring. Dr. Hartwell. My apartment door is unlocked, she said. Her voice sounded calmer than her pulse. I did not leave it that way. There was no pause long enough for fear to grow. Step away from the door. I already did. Go back downstairs. Do not use the elevator. I know how to leave a building, then leave faster. Grace wanted to snap at him. But this was not the moment to prove she hated being ordered around. She moved down the stairs, one flight at a time, her hand tight around her phone. By the time she reached the lobby, a black SUV was already pulling up to the curb. Lucien stepped out before the vehicle fully stopped. No army, no spectacle, just him in a dark coat, rain shining on his shoulders, with Rocco coming around the other side. Lucien looked at her first, not the building. His eyes moved over her face, her hands, the pendant at her throat, checking for injury the way Grace checked patients without asking. I am fine, she said. I didn't ask. You looked. I did. There was no apology in it, also no shame. Rocco went upstairs first. Lucien remained with Grace in the lobby, close enough to intervene, far enough not to crowd her. That distance annoyed her, because it was thoughtful. Men like Lucien were easier to distrust when they behaved exactly as monsters were supposed to behave. A few minutes later, Rocco called. Lucien listened without speaking, his face emptying into something cold. Grace knew before he said it. They were inside, Lucien said. She closed her eyes for half a second. What did they take? Nothing obvious. That means they were looking for something. Yes. Grace looked up toward the stairwell. I need to see. Lucien's jaw tightened. No, my apartment. Not until it's cleared. She stared at him. You do not give orders in my home. For the first time, something like impatience cut through his calm. Then I will ask badly. Please do not walk into a room that may still contain someone who came there to scare you, search you, or kill you. The words landed hard because they were not dramatic. They were practical. Grace hated practical fear. It always made the most sense. When Rocco finally allowed her upstairs, the apartment looked almost normal at first. That was the worst part. The couch was where she had left it. The lamp still glowed beside Thomas Seale's old reading chair. The framed photograph from their anniversary trip still sat on the shelf, slightly crooked now, as if someone had picked it up and put it back without caring. Then she saw the office. Thomas's files had been pulled from drawers and scattered across the floor. Old tax documents, insurance statements, hospital letters, and personal notes lay in ugly little piles. The desk drawers were open. The closet boxes had been searched. The safe under the bookshelf, where Grace kept passports and birth certificates, had been emptied onto the rug. They didn't take jewelry, Rocco said from the doorway. Laptop's still there. Cash in the bedroom drawer too. They wanted Thomas, Grace said. Lucien stood near the hall, silent. Grace moved into the bathroom and stopped. On the mirror, written in her own red lipstick, were the words, "Widows should know when to stay quiet." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Not much, just enough. Grace gripped the edge of the sink and breathed through it, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The same rhythm she taught panicked patients when their bodies forgot that air was still available. Lucien appeared behind her in the doorway. He did not touch her. "Pack a bag," he said. This time, she did not argue immediately. That frightened her more than the message on the mirror. "I have a shift tomorrow, you can call out." "No," she turned. "If I disappear, Mercer knows I am scared." Lucien looked at the writing on the glass. "You are scared, yes," Grace said. "But he does to get to know how much." Something shifted in Lucien's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "Pack for 2 nights," he said. "Not because you are running. Because you are choosing where to stand until we know who has keys to your life." That was harder to fight. Grace packed 1 bag, clothes, medication, chargers. The duplicate notes from her office drawer. Thomas's photograph with Sophia. She almost left the anniversary picture on the shelf, then turned back and put it in the bag too. She was angry at Thomas, she was broken by him, but grief was not a switch, and love did not leave just because truth entered the room. Lucian saw the photograph but said nothing. His house was not what Grace expected. No gold gates, no marble lions, no vulgar announcement of power. It was an old brick home on a quiet street, large but not loud, with dark wood floors, heavy doors, and the kind of silence that came from people learning not to ask questions in hallways. A woman named Mrs. Bell showed Grace to a guest room. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pinned low and eyes that noticed everything. She gave Grace towels, water, and no false comfort. Grace appreciated that. At 2 in the morning, sleep still had not come. Grace went downstairs and found Lucian in the kitchen making coffee, as if sleeplessness were a scheduled appointment. He looked up. "You should be resting. You should be less predictable." He poured a second cup and set it across from him. Grace sat because she was too tired to pretend she did not want coffee. For a while, they said nothing. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. Somewhere in the house, old pipes shifted. The kitchen smelled like coffee and lemon soap. Finally, Grace asked, "Do you always watch people the way you watched me in that room?" Lucian did not answer quickly. "No," he said at last. "That night. I wasn't watching you." Grace looked at him. "I was trying to decide whether grief had finally made me see ghosts." The honesty was so quiet it almost hurt. Grace wrapped both hands around the mug. "I don't know which version of my husband am grieving." Lucian's eyes lowered to his coffee. "Maybe both. The man who loved you, and the man who lied to you. Grief does not always let us choose one." Grace wanted to hate the comfort in that. She wanted it to sound rehearsed, manipulative, useful, but it sounded like something he had learned the hard way. Her phone buzzed on the table. "Claire," Grace answered immediately. "I got into the hidden folder," Claire said, breathless. "The one on Thomas's drive." Grace sat straighter. "What is it?" "It is labeled Saint," across from her. Lucian went completely still. Grace looked at him. "What?" His voice was low when he answered. "That S, what they call Mercer." Grace held the phone tighter. The rain kept falling outside, soft and steady, as if the city were trying to wash itself clean. But some stains, Grace was beginning to understand, did not come off with water. Claire arrived at Lucian de Luca's house a little after 3 in the morning, wearing a raincoat over sweatpants and the expression of a woman who had driven across Philadelphia, rehearsing every possible way she might die. Rocco met her at the door. Claire looked him up and down, then looked past him into the hallway. "If anyone plans to threaten me, kidnap me, or offer me espresso before sunrise, I'd like to know now." Rocco did not smile, but something in his eyes shifted. "Coffee S in the kitchen," he said. "Threats depend on how loud you get." Claire stepped inside. "I'm a lawyer. Loud is part of the service." Grace stood at the kitchen island with Lucian beside her. Though not too close, the laptop sat open between them. The hidden folder Claire had found on Thomas's USB drive was labeled Saint, and inside it were scanned invoices, bank transfers, photos of medication boxes, and one video file named For Grace. Claire had not opened it. She said there were some things a widow deserved to see before anyone else explained them to her. Grace wished she could be grateful for that. Instead, she felt hollow. The kind of hollow that came before a diagnosis was spoken out loud. She knew the illness was already there. She was only waiting for the name. Lucian did not touch the laptop. He stood with one hand resting on the back of a chair, his face unreadable. Grace could feel him watching her, but this time she did not snap at him. The house was quiet except for the rain tapping against the windows and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Even Claire, who usually filled silence to keep fear from growing inside it, said nothing. Grace pressed play. Thomas appeared on the screen, sitting in the front seat of his car. The image was dim, lit by dashboard light and a street lamp somewhere beyond the windshield. He looked thinner than Grace remembered, older, not in years, but in fear. His hair was messy, his tie loosened, his eyes red from too little sleep. For one terrible second, Grace forgot to hate him. She only saw the man who used to leave coffee on her nightstand before early shifts, the man who knew she hated lilies but loved white roses. The man who had once danced barefoot with her in the kitchen because the power had gone out during a storm. Then he began to speak. Grace, Thomas said, his voice rough. If you re-watching this, I'm in either dead or too much of a coward to tell you in person. I hope it's the second one. I'm afraid it won to be. Grace's hand tightened on the edge of the counter. Thomas looked away, then back at the camera. I worked for Elliot Mercer before I ever met you. Not officially. Not in a way that would show up on a contract you could find. I handled numbers, vendor payments, false inventory reports, pharmaceutical shipments that were supposed to look like donations. At first, I told myself I was just moving paperwork. That is how men like Mercer survive. They make sin look administrative, Claire whispered. Damn. Grace did not move. Thomas swallowed, then people started dying. Not all at once, not dramatically. Poor patients, elderly patients. People without families, who could afford lawyers. Medication failed. And the hospital called it complications. Mercer called it loss exposure. I called it what it was too late. The video flickered slightly as Thomas adjusted the phone. Sophia DeLuca found the pattern before I did. She was brave in a way that made me ashamed to stand near her. She knew the drugs were counterfeit. She knew the deaths were being buried. She brought me evidence because she thought an accountant would understand the trail. She was right. His mouth twisted. I understood it. I just didn't act fast enough. Lucian's face changed at Sophia's name, barely, but Grace saw it. Thomas continued. Mercer found out she had copies. Sophia died 2 nights later. I let myself believe I could stay quiet and survive. Then Mercer gave me a new job. He told me there was an ER doctor asking too many questions about patient outcomes. Smart, careful, too honest for her own good. Grace stopped breathing. Thomas closed his eyes in the video. That doctor was you, Grace. The kitchen seemed to disappear. I was told to get close to you, Thomas said. I was told to learn what you knew, what you noticed, who you talked to. I did. I came into your life because Mercer sent me, and then I loved you. That is true. I know it may not matter now. I know the lie may be too large for the love to survive inside it, but I loved you. I loved you every day after the lie, and that made what I did worse, not better. Grace reached forward and paused the video. No one spoke. For a moment, she could hear her own heartbeat. It was too loud, too steady, an insult, almost. That her body could keep working while everything inside her changed shape. Claire touched her arm. Grace. Grace pulled away. Not harshly, but enough. She looked at Lucian. You knew. His answer came quietly. No, but you suspected. I suspected Thomas was involved. You let me sit here and watch this. It was yours to hear from him. Grace laughed once, without humor. You needed the necklace. Thomas needed access to me. Mercer needed my silence. Tell me how you are different from any of them. Lucian did not defend himself quickly. That made her angrier. Tell me, she said. He met her eyes. Because I told you what I wanted from the beginning. I needed the truth. I still do, but I never needed you small. The words landed in a place she was not ready to have touched. Grace turned away. She hated Thomas. She missed Thomas. She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to ask him whether any dinner, any touch, any quiet morning had belonged only to them. She wanted to punish someone living, because the dead man on the screen could no longer answer. Lucian spoke again, softer this time. The night Sophia died, she called me. Grace looked back despite herself. She said she had proof. She said she no longer trusted local authorities. I was in the middle of a negotiation with men I believed were more dangerous than paperwork and hospital boards. His jaw tightened. I told her to wait 2 hours, 2 hours. By sunrise she was dead. The room went still, for 12 years. Lucian said. I punished men I thought were connected to her death. Some deserved it. Some only knew pieces, all the while. Mercer stood on stages, accepted awards, and smiled beside children he was using as cover. Grace looked at the frozen image of Thomas on the laptop screen. Then at the pendant around her neck. So stop paying the wrong debt, she said. Lucian's eyes lifted to hers. And what is the right one? Grace's voice was low, but it did not shake. Make sure no one else dies quietly. Outside, the rain softened against the windows. Inside, no one moved. For the first time since Thomas died. Grace felt something other than grief pulling her forward. Not forgiveness, not yet. Purpose. By morning, Grace Hartwell understood something she had spent most of her life trying not to learn. The truth did not arrive like a light turning on. It arrived like a door opening in a burning house. Once it opened, you could see the way out, but you could also feel the heat. You could smell what had already been lost, and if you wanted to survive, you had to move before the smoke convinced you to stay still. She went back to the hospital because staying hidden would have given Mercer exactly what he wanted. She wore her white coat. She answered questions. She checked charts. She adjusted medication orders with hands that did not shake. But every time she entered the medication room, every bottle looked different. Every label looked like a promise that might have been broken before it reached her patients. Samuel O'Rourke's empty bed had already been cleaned. A new patient lay there by noon. That was how hospitals survived. They reset the room. They changed the sheets. They moved the living into the spaces where the dead had just been. Grace had always accepted that as necessary. Now it felt cruel. At 3 in the afternoon, an invitation arrived in her hospital email. The subject line read, Community Trust Gala featured speaker confirmation. Grace opened it and stared. Elliot Mercer was hosting a public event that Friday night to announce a new hospital initiative for underserved neighborhoods. He had personally requested that Dr. Grace Hartwell deliver remarks on trust, care, and the future of community medicine. For a few seconds, Grace simply sat at her desk. Then she laughed once. Not because it was funny, because the arrogance of it was almost beautiful. Mercer was not hiding. He was placing her under lights. If she refused, she looked unstable. If she attended and said nothing, she helped him polish the same image that had protected him for years. If she accused him without evidence strong enough to survive public scrutiny, he would destroy her career before dessert was served. Grace forwarded the email to Claire, then called Lucien. He answered before the second ring finished. No, he said. Grace leaned back in her chair. I haven't said anything yet. You are going to the gala. Yes, no, for a man who claims not to own me, you use that word a lot. A pause. Then his voice lowered. This is a trap, I know. Mercer does not invite women he fears unless he has already decided where the exits are. Then we use a different door. Lucien said nothing for a moment. Grace could hear movement on his end, a door closing, voices fading. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Grace, he killed my sister. He killed your husband. He has already reached inside your apartment. Do not mistake public lighting for safety. I am not, then why go? Grace looked through the glass wall of her office toward the emergency department. A nurse was helping an old woman into a wheelchair. A father held a sleeping child against his shoulder. A janitor cleaned a spill near the triage desk while two administrators walked past without seeing him. Because men like Mercer survive by making everyone wait for a safer room to tell the truth, she said. There is no safer room. Lucien did not argue after that. That frightened her more than his refusal had. On Friday night, Grace dressed in black again. Not the same dress from the fundraiser. This one was simpler, higher at the neck, with the silver pendant resting in plain sight. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because she looked different, but because she no longer looked like someone waiting for grief to explain itself. Claire arrived 20 minutes before they left, carrying a laptop bag and enough legal aggression to power a small city. The files are scheduled, Claire said. If I do not manually delay the release every 30 minutes, the package goes to Mara Vance at the Tribune. Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Price and the Medical Oversight Board. Grace nodded. Good. Claire studied her. You understand that if this goes badly, we don't just lose jobs, I know. No, Grace, listen to me. We lose control. That is the part people do not understand about truth. Once it leaves your hands, it does not behave for you. Grace touched the pendant. Maybe it should, T. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel, the same building where Grace had first walked into the wrong room. The symmetry was so obvious it felt intentional. Mercer liked stages. He liked symbols. He liked watching people stand exactly where he placed them. This time, Grace did not enter through the wrong door. She walked through the front. The room went silent again, not completely at first. Conversation thinned in layers. A woman near the bar stopped mid-sentence. A hospital board member turned, saw Grace, and looked quickly toward the balcony. A reporter raised her phone. Someone whispered Thomas Hartwell's name. Someone else whispered DeLuca. Grace kept walking. At the far end of the room, Mercer stood beneath a banner about healthcare equity, smiling like a man carved out of clean marble. On the second-floor balcony, Lucian DeLuca watched her. The first night, that gaze had felt like danger. Tonight, it felt like a line drawn behind her, not a cage, not a command, a witness. Mercer greeted her near the stage. "Dr. Hartwell, you look composed." Grace looked at his white suit, his careful smile. The crowd gathered around him like worshippers who did not know the altar was stained. "So do you," she said. His smile sharpened. When it was time for her speech, Grace walked to the podium. The lights were bright enough to blind the first rows, which helped. She could hear her own breath in the microphone. She could feel the pendant against her skin. Somewhere in the room, Claire would be starting the file transfer. Somewhere above, Lucian would be watching Mercer more than he watched her. Grace looked out at the ballroom. "I was asked to speak tonight about trust," she began. "That is a difficult word in medicine. Patients trust us with pain they cannot explain. Families trust us with people they cannot imagine losing. Poor patients trust a system that has failed them so often, they sometimes apologize before asking to be treated." The room settled. Grace continued. "Last week, a man named Samuel O'Rourke died in our emergency department. He was 72. He worked most of his life. He did not have power, wealth, or a room full of donors waiting to hear his name. But his life mattered, and when medicine fails someone like him, we do not get to hide behind the word complication just because it is convenient." Mercer's smile remained, but his eyes changed. Grace let the silence grow. "In medicine, silence is not neutral," she said. "When we see harm and say nothing, silence becomes part of the treatment plan." No one moved. For the second time in her life, Grace stood in a room that had gone completely silent, but this time, she knew why. After the applause finally came, it sounded uncertain, almost guilty. Mercer met her backstage in a narrow hallway lined with black curtains. He did not touch her. "He was too careful for that. Your husband learned too late," Mercer said softly. "That truth does not protect anyone." Grace looked him in the eye. "No," she said, "but witnesses do." For the first time, Mercer's mask cracked. Grace's phone buzzed a minute later. A message from Claire. Files sent. Then another message appeared. Not from Claire's number. From unknown. "Tell Grace her lawyer should have stayed out of this." For a moment, Grace Hartwell did not understand the message on her phone. Her eyes read the words, but her mind refused to let them become real. Tell Grace her lawyer should have stayed out of this. The ballroom noise behind the black curtain seemed to move farther away. Applause, glasses, polite laughter. The soft music starting again as if nothing had happened. Mercer stood a few feet from her, in the narrow service hallway, his white suit untouched. His face calm in the way only very practiced men could manage. Grace looked at him, then down at the phone, then back at him. Mercer smiled gently. "You should answer that." The phone rang before Grace could move. Claire's name appeared on the screen. Grace answered. But she did not speak. For 2 seconds, she heard only breathing. Then Claire's voice came through, tight and frightened but alive. "Grace." Grace closed her eyes for half a heartbeat. Alive mattered. Alive meant there was still a next move. Before Claire could say anything else, a man took the phone. "Pier 9, he said. "Midnight, bring the original drive, no police. No DeLuca, if you try to be clever. Your friend becomes another sad woman found too late." The call ended. Mercer watched her with almost paternal disappointment. "You should have stayed a doctor, Grace. Doctors are useful. Martyrs are expensive." Grace slipped the phone into her purse. Her hands wanted to shake. She did not allow them to. In emergency medicine, panic was a luxury other people could afford. The person holding pressure on the wound had to stay useful. "You're remaking a mistake," she said. Mercer sighed softly. "No, your husband made a mistake. Sophia DeLuca made a mistake. Your friend made a mistake. You are simply standing in the pattern." Grace walked past him without another word. He let her go. That told her more than a threat would have. Mercer was confident because he believed the board was set. He believed Lucian would come angry. He believed anger would make him careless. A mafia boss at the docks, a kidnapped lawyer, a dead woman, perhaps. It would be easy to tell the city what it already expected to hear. Grace stepped into the main ballroom, found Lucian on the balcony, and looked at him once, only once. Then she turned away. She did not go home. She went to Claire's office, because Claire had taught her that fear should always be given a task. She pulled the duplicate drive from the safe, copied the final files onto 2 encrypted folders, and set a timed release. If she did not enter a code by 12:20, everything would go to Mara Vance at the Tribune, Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Price, the Medical Oversight Board, and 3 patient advocacy organizations. She added Samuel O'Rourke's medication lot number. She added Thomas' video. She added a note naming Pier 9. Then she wrote one message by hand and left it on Claire's desk, knowing Lucian would find it because men like him had ways of finding what frightened women tried to hide. Donna, come to save me. Come to witness. At 11:48, Grace drove toward the harbor with the original drive in her coat pocket and Sophia's pendant cold against her skin. The city changed as she moved east. The lights grew fewer, the streets widened, the air began to smell like diesel, salt, wet metal, and old work. Pier 9 sat beyond a chain-link gate near stacked containers and dark water. It was part of the city most people never saw. The part that moved goods, secrets, and money while the clean neighborhood slept. Claire was on her knees near a warehouse door, hands tied in front of her, hair wet from the rain. 2 men stood beside her. Mercer stood under a yellow security light in his white suit, which should have looked ridiculous near the docks, but somehow made him seem obscene. Like he believed even the dirt had no right to touch him. Grace walked toward him. "You came alone," Mercer said. "No," Grace answered. "I came without Lucian." His smile thinned. "That is not the same thing. No, it is tea." She pulled the drive from her pocket and held it up. One of Mercer's men reached for it. Grace let him take it. Claire looked at her, eyes wide. "Grace, no." Grace kept her gaze on Mercer. "You have the original, let her go." Mercer studied her. "You think this ends with a trade?" "No," Grace said. "I think this ends because you still believe the truth lives in one place." For the first time, Mercer's face changed. Grace continued, her voice steady. "If I don't enter a code in 10 minutes, the full package goes out. Press, federal prosecutors, oversight boards, patient advocates. You can destroy the drive. You can kill me. You can dump Claire in the river. It wouldn't matter." Mercer's hand closed slowly at his side. Then headlights cut across the pier. Not many, just 2 cars. Lucian stepped out of the first, Rocco beside him. From the second car came Mara Vance with a camera bag over her shoulder and Daniel Price in a dark raincoat, holding his phone as if a recording had already begun. Mercer stared at them, then laughed once. "You brought the law." Lucian looked at him through the rain. "No, I brought the room." The words settled over the pier like a verdict. Grace understood then. The first room had gone silent because Lucian watched her. This time, Lucian had created a room Mercer could not control. Witnesses, cameras, law, press, truth. No darkness left to hide behind. Mercer's men hesitated. That was all Rocco needed. He moved fast, not theatrically, not cruelly, just enough to separate them from Claire. Daniel Price spoke into his phone, calm and official. While sirens began somewhere beyond the warehouse road, Mara's camera light came on. Mercer did not run. Men like him rarely believed the door had closed until their hand was on the knob. When federal agents arrived, Mercer was still standing beneath the yellow light, wet and furious, the white suit finally stained at the cuffs. As they moved to cuff him, he looked at Lucian. "She died calling your name," Mercer said softly. "Did you know that?" Lucian went still. Every sound on the pier seemed to drop away. Grace saw Rocco shift, one nod from Lucian, one step, 1 second. And Mercer would never make it to trial. Mercer smiled because he knew it too. Grace walked closer, rain running down her face. She did not touch Lucian, she did not beg him, she only said, "Sophia was a nurse, don't to make her grave part of this." Lucian's jaw tightened. His eyes stayed on Mercer, then slowly he stepped back. Mercer's smile died. The agents took him away. Claire leaned against Grace, shaking now that she no longer had to be brave. Grace held her with one arm and watched the black water move against the pier. Justice, she realized, did not sound like thunder. Sometimes it sounded like handcuffs closing. Sometimes it sounded like a dangerous man choosing not to become what his enemy needed him to be. By morning, Philadelphia knew Elliot Mercer's name in a different way. It was no longer printed beneath photographs of ribbon cuttings and hospital donations. It was spoken by reporters standing outside federal buildings, by nurses in break rooms, by families who had lost people they were once told had died from complications. The Saint of Philadelphia had been arrested at Pier 9 with counterfeit medication records, offshore payment trails, and a federal prosecutor's recorded statement already moving through the system before Mercer's lawyers could build a wall around him. Grace Hartwell watched the news from the corner of the emergency department staff lounge with a paper cup of coffee going cold in her hands. Her face appeared on the screen for 3 seconds, captured at the gala podium, calm beneath the lights. The caption called her a whistleblower. Grace hated the word immediately. It sounded clean. It sounded brave in a way that left out the nausea, the fear, the way Claire's hands had shaken after the cuffs closed around Mercer's wrists. It left out Thomas's video and Sophia's necklace and Samuel O'Rourke's empty bed. It left out the part where doing the right thing did not feel like victory while your whole life was still bleeding. No one in the lounge spoke to her at first. A few nurses glanced over and then looked away. One resident gave her a nervous nod, as if courage might be contagious, and he was not sure he wanted to catch it. Grace understood. Institutions taught people how to survive by lowering their eyes. She had done it too, in smaller ways. On days when she told herself she was too tired to fight one more administrative lie. Then a young nurse named Emily approached with a chart hugged against her chest. She was usually bright, quick with jokes, the kind of nurse who remembered patients' children's names. That morning she looked older. "My uncle died here last year," Emily said quietly. "Blood thinner didn't work. They told us it was his age." Grace set the coffee down. Emily swallowed. "My mom kept saying something was wrong, but nobody listened. I just wanted to say thank you for not letting it stay buried." Grace had prepared herself for accusations, for headlines, for board members pretending they had always supported transparency. She had not prepared herself for gratitude, and that was what nearly broke her. "I'm sorry," Grace said. Emily nodded. "Me too," after her shift. Grace found Lucian waiting outside near the ambulance bay. He stood beside a black car, hands in his coat pockets, looking like a man who had no business standing under hospital lights and yet somehow belonged anywhere people were afraid to say his name. For once, he did not look at the pendant first. He looked at her face. "You should be resting," he said. "You say that a lot for someone who never sleeps." A faint smile touched his mouth, then disappeared. "Mercer's lawyers will come after you. I know. The hospital may suspend you while they investigate. I know that too. And if my name stays attached to yours, everything gets harder." Grace looked at him carefully. The words were controlled, but she heard what lived beneath them. Not fear, not exactly. Restraint. Lucian DeLuca knew how to take, how to command, how to make people move around him. He did not know how to offer someone freedom without making it sound like abandonment. "I can step back," he said. "No calls, no visits. Protection from a distance. You will not have to carry my shadow too." Grace was quiet for a moment. An ambulance pulled in behind them, lights flashing without sirens. Two paramedics moved fast, and Grace's body almost turned toward the work out of habit. Instead, she stayed. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "Or is that what you think a decent man is supposed to offer?" Lucian did not answer. That was answer enough. Grace stepped closer, not much, just enough to make the choice visible. "I don't need you harmless, Lucian. I need you honest. There's a difference." His eyes held hers. "I will not quit medicine," she said. "I will not move into your house like something that needs guarding. I will not lie for you if you cross a line I cannot live with. And I will not become a decoration in your world because men are more comfortable when women stand quietly beside power." Lucian listened without interrupting. The old Lucian, the one the city feared, might have mistaken her terms for defiance. This one seemed to understand they were a gift. Grace was not walking away. She was telling him where the bridge could hold. At last he said, "I have owned docks, judges, debts, and silence. I do not want to own you." Grace's throat tightened, though she kept her voice steady. "Then what do you want?" Lucian looked past her toward the hospital doors, where pain entered all day and sometimes left alive, to be the man you do not have to survive. For the first time since the night, she walked into the silent room. Grace reached for his hand, not because she was safe, because she was still herself. 6 weeks later, Grace Hartwell sat before a federal grand jury and told the truth without raising her voice. She wore a navy dress, no white coat, no hospital badge, no armor except the silver pendant resting at her throat. Across the room, men and women listened as she described medication lots that failed, patients whose deaths had been mislabeled, invoices that told a cleaner story than the bodies did, and a husband who had entered her life through a lie but died trying to return the truth. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. Once, when Thomas' video was mentioned, her fingers tightened. That was all. She did not perform grief for anyone. She had learned that pain did not become more real just because other people could see it. Lucien sat 3 rows behind her. He had come without Rocco, without visible protection, without the dark theater Philadelphia expected from him. He looked like any other man in a courtroom hallway, except no one who passed him believed that for long. He did not speak to Grace before she testified. He only nodded once when she entered, and that was enough. The first time she had felt him watching her, she thought it meant danger. Now she understood there were different kinds of watching. Some men watched to own, some watched to threaten. Lucien watched like a man teaching himself not to interfere with another person as courage. Mercer was indicted before the end of the month. The headlines were everywhere. Hospital officials resigned, pharmaceutical shipments were seized, old patient deaths were reopened, including Samuel O'Rourke's. There was no perfect justice. Grace knew better than to expect that. The dead did not come back because the living finally found the right documents. But families who had been told to accept confusion were given names, dates, evidence, and the dignity of knowing they had not been foolish to ask questions. On a cold Friday morning, the Sophia DeLuca Community Clinic opened its doors in South Philadelphia. Lucien had paid for the building with legitimate money, and Grace had made sure everyone knew the difference between charity and accountability. There would be an independent board, public audits, licensed pharmacists, patient advocates, and no man powerful enough to hide mistakes behind donations. Lucien had listened to every condition without argument. When Grace asked why, he said only, "Because this place is not mine." She had looked at him then, and for the first time, she believed he understood. Teresa DeLuca came to the opening wearing a black coat and Sophia's old pearl earrings. She stood before the clinic sign for a long time, one hand pressed against her heart. Grace stood beside her in silence until Teresa reached over and touched the pendant gently with 2 fingers. "My daughter carried the truth as far as she could," Teresa said. "Your husband carried it farther. You carried it into the light." Grace looked through the glass doors at the waiting room, already filling with patients. "I almost did." Teresa smiled sadly. "Courage is rarely early, dear. Most of the time, it arrives shaking, that night." Grace returned to the restaurant where everything had begun. Lucien walked beside her, not ahead of her. When the private room door opened, conversation stopped again. The same kind of silence fell. But Grace no longer mistook it for power. Men looked at her, then at Lucien, then at the pendant. They remembered the woman who had walked in by accident. They understood she had not left the same way. Grace glanced at Lucien. "The first night, I thought silence meant danger, and now?" he asked. "Now I know sometimes silence means people are realizing they underestimated the wrong woman." Outside, after dinner, the city moved around them in headlights and winter air. Lucien stood close but did not touch her until she reached for his hand. "Are you staying?" he asked. Grace knew what he meant. Not his house, not his world, the truth between them. "I am not staying because I am safe with you," she said. "I am staying because I am still myself when I stand next to you." Lucien lowered his eyes for a moment, as if the words had given him something fragile to hold. And Grace finally understood why the room had gone silent that first night. It was not because she had walked into danger. It was because the truth had walked in with her. And everyone in that room had recognized it before she did. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
The meaning of this story is not about crime, violence, or the power of a mafia boss. At its heart, this is a story about silence and what happens when one person finally has the courage to break it. Grace Hartwell walked into a room she did not understand. At first, she thought the silence meant danger. Later, she discovered it meant something much deeper. It meant guilt. It meant fear. It meant powerful men had been hiding the truth for years, while innocent people paid the price. The most important lesson in this story is that truth is rarely convenient. Sometimes the truth destroys the version of life we wanted to believe in. Grace had to face the painful reality that her husband had lied to her. Lucian had to face the fact that revenge could never bring his sister back. Both of them had to choose whether they would stay trapped in pain or use that pain to protect others. That is where real strength begins. Strength is not always loud. It is not always a gun, a threat, or a man who can make a room go silent. Sometimes strength is a woman standing at a microphone with shaking hands, telling the truth because someone else no longer can. Sometimes strength is a dangerous man choosing justice instead of revenge. Sometimes strength is admitting that love, grief, guilt, and loyalty can all live inside the same heart. This story teaches us that silence can protect evil when good people are too afraid to speak. But it also teaches us that courage does not have to arrive perfectly. It can arrive tired. It can arrive broken. It can arrive late. What matters is that it arrives. And when one person refuses to look away, the truth finally has a chance to breathe.